Thank you so much, Commissioner, for this heartwarming speech, in the sense that putting little boys and girls at the heart of what European development policy is critical, and putting the evidence to make sure that we are helping them is equally critical. We are now starting a session on one attempt to do just that, putting evidence and innovation at the heart of development policy, with a very innovative effort that was spearheaded by Michael Kremer a few years ago at USAID, and continued, spearheaded by Hervé Berville in France. I will first introduce Michael, who will speak to us, then Hervé, and then the next speaker I'll introduce later. Michael, I guess, probably doesn't really need much of an introduction in this room, but it's my pleasure to do it anyway. He's, of course, a winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics for 2019, for something I also know about. Before that, he got any number of awards, but most importantly for me is he's a teacher, he's a mentor. He was one of my thesis advisors. He is is the first person who introduced me, and along with me, a series of youngsters to the joys and perils of running randomized control trials. And at that time, I would emphasize the perils. It is through his resilience and determination to continue going with it, because he was so committed that it could make a difference, that all of us are here. Many other people got to work with him down the line, but this early energy, despite maybe what people may have been thinking of him at that time, from moving from microeconomics to do this weird stuff, to the early surprises, was fundamental. And I think it comes from something that ran through Michael's life, which is the fundamental yearning for making a difference in the lives of people. And you see that from even before he joined for his PhD, founding World Teach, to send, first of all, going to teach in Kenya himself, and coming back, founding World Teach, to send other young people teaching around the world. Today, World Teach has sent over 7,000 volunteers around the world. And then, over his entire career, keeping going at it, creating new institutions that have endured and make a difference. The USAID Development Innovation Venture is one of them, and that's, among other things, what he's going to talk about today. Michael, thank you for what you are, and thank you for talking to us today.
Thanks so much for that very kind introduction. I'm delighted to be here at this anniversary of JPAL and to celebrate their work. It was wonderful to hear about some of the examples this morning. It's wonderful to hear about what Europe is doing to address these issues of inequity that plague the world, but that, as was emphasized, we can change. You know, we heard in the first sessions of this morning lots of examples of very impressive things that had come out of JPAL's work. And what I'd like to do today is to try to have a quantitative analysis of this that's going to because when one cites examples, there's a tendency to talk about the successful examples. And as Esther pointed out, you know, there are many cases of less than complete success, if one wants to put it that way. So where does this balance out? So what for science, for natural science, we have a number of studies that try to look at the social rate of return to investments in agricultural science and health. And these estimates often come up with very, very high numbers, estimates like 55% rate of return. Those are, if you think about what return you're getting on your investments in your bank account, or even if you put money in the stock market, it's a lot less than that. But the social value of these investments in science is tremendous. Now, there's less research on, or less evidence on what's the rate of return to investments in two other areas of innovation. One is social science research of the type that JPAL does, of using on practical social problems. But there's a view that these things, there may be some cases where they translate into policy, but maybe there are a lot of cases where they don't. Certainly there are a lot of cases where it doesn't. What's the overall impact of this? And then one other area goes by different names: social entrepreneurship or impact investing, trying to do things through the private sector that are going to not just create commercial return, but social impact as well. And I'm now, I guess it's not up there, but if you read in the small print, I'm now at the University of Chicago, and there's a tradition at the University of Chicago of being pretty skeptical about sort of deliberate efforts to invest in areas where the private sector could be investing. And if there's really good opportunity there, the private sector will take it. And if not, then maybe the government shouldn't go in its clumsy way and invest in these areas. So I think there's grounds to question what the impact is. And so this paper or the work that I'll present is a way to shed a little bit of light on that. And what we'll do is by the way, I should I edited this slide this morning, and out came the bottom row of this was a disclosure that I'm involved with Development Innovation Ventures. I'm scientific director there, so I should acknowledge that, even though it was pushed off my slide. But I'm going to give examples on a category of a social investment fund, open, tiered, evidence-based social innovation funds. So two examples of that are Development Innovation Ventures in the US, and here in Europe and in France in particular, FID, which is, I think, a very exciting initiative in this area. So how do these funds work? Well, they tend to be pretty open. Obviously, can never be completely open. There's going to be, issues of particular interest and importance. But they try to be pretty open across sectors, across countries. I was just hearing about AFD working in 130 countries. They're open across investments, commercial, things that might scale up commercially, and across things that might scale up through the public sector. So on the one hand, they're very open in an effort, any organization's going to have to decide certain priority areas. We're going to focus some big projects there. But I think one thing we all learn in this business is there's a lot of good ideas out there, and they're not all based in one place. So we try to be open to ideas coming in that we hadn't expected. We then have tiered funding. So first, and this is where we're particularly open, is for piloting new ideas. So we try to look, is it potentially cost effective? Is there some obvious, something that makes it obviously politically impossible to scale if the idea is to scale through the public sector? But it's fairly light requirements at that stage. We do send it out for peer review by experts. Then there's, for things that have gotten through the pilot stage, either internally or externally, you complement that openness with a tiered evidence-based approach. So it's only small amounts of funding that go for that first piloting stage. Before larger amounts of funding are provided, and to avoid the potential for waste when or I don't want to say avoid, you can never avoid it, but to try to address the potential for waste when you're investing in innovation. By definition, you don't know whether an innovation is going to work. The second stage involves rigorous testing. That's not necessarily with the experimental approach, but in many cases it is. And then for the things that have proven most successful and to have the most impact, and that seem to deliver the most impact per dollar in the US case, or euro, I guess, in FID, spent, there's efforts to transition this to scale. So I wanted to take a look. DIV has been around a bit over a decade, so we wanted to take a look at the number of questions. First, which types of innovation scale? If we can get some evidence on this, maybe that can make things more efficient going forward. Second, is this social innovation a good investment? We know that scientific research is a very good investment, but how about this type of social science research and efforts to create new business models? And then based on, so some of the results that we got were quite a surprise, and I think it actually, thinking about them, gives some insight into thinking about what the role of social innovation funds are, how they should be designed, or at least I'll speculate on that. Okay. So let me start with just some basic data. We looked at the first, our early portfolio over our first few years, since it takes some time for innovations to scale. And we invested in 41 different programs over this time. And here's some information on the extent, a first measure, which is the number of people reached. And so if you look at the numbers 1 through 23 or 24, it's going to be very small numbers on this scale. And you go, in fact, if you go up to 31, okay? But then if you think about which ones reached over 1 million, there were 9 of these that did that out of the first 41 things that we supported. Now the scale over there, there's a little break in the scale. It's very hard to put this all in one graph. It's a very skewed pattern. And this, of course, is very typical when you're supporting innovation. If you look at venture capital firms, for example, their typical investment doesn't make that much money. But the investment fund as a whole can be very successful. If they invest in Google, then that allows them a lot of scope for some investments that didn't go as well. Or if you look at citation counts in academic work, for example, very similar skewed pattern. Okay. So for our first question, I'll come back to this later on, but let me, on issues of what was the overall impact. We don't want to measure that just in number of people reached, and how do you aggregate up this evidence of a combination of lots of things that didn't scale and a few that do. But let me first ask the question, with our limited data here, what are the determinants of scaling, or what are the correlates? So one question is, there's a view out there that pilots never scale, and that it's piloting things can be a waste of money. And in fact, when we look at our rate of scaling, we do see there was a higher, we only funded one, so these were the funding cutoffs at the time, they've changed. But at the time, we only funded one stage 3 proposal, and that one scaled. But if you go down to stage 1, only 17% of them did. So you might draw the conclusion that it's not worth investing in these early stage things. You really have to make a big push. You get a very different picture if you look at this relative to the amount of money spent. So if you look at the people reached per dollar spent, that was actually highest. I don't want to make a big deal of this given the sample size of 1 in stage 3, but it was actually highest for the stage 1 grants. So I think that suggests that at a minimum we shouldn't write off the piloting, and many of these things scaled in quite unexpected ways. So I would certainly personally take the view that it's worth trying to have that type of stage one approach for early stage ideas and not trying to be too prescriptive in terms of lots of bureaucratic requirements for fairly small grants, in terms of, the government has to, if it's going to scale through the government, we need the government to invest in it. Maybe they're not willing to do that at stage one, but they might do that later on. Okay. Here are some other correlates. So one, and we had to some extent thought about this, and it did come out strongly in the data, is that inexpensive interventions, or inexpensive innovations, I should say, were most likely to scale. Things that were less than $3. There's nothing magic about that number, but it was, I think, the point on cost. We're aiming for innovations for low and middle income countries. It has to be inexpensive. I don't want to say it has to be. There's exceptions to every rule. You'll see in the red there. But it's easier if it's inexpensive. Okay, a second finding is that makes sense when you think about the first. If you're looking at something that's very inexpensive and you're trying to set up your own brand new distribution network, the customer acquisition costs are very high. So a lot of social entrepreneurs think, I'm going to produce this new health good and sell that directly customer to customer. Well, that's a hard business to be in. Generally, the innovations that were more successful had a strategy of selling to institutions, either big businesses that already had networks or governments. Okay. Then, and perhaps there's some tie here. There's sometimes a view, particularly in the social entrepreneurship world, that rigorous testing is slow, which it sometimes can be, that it's and that it just throws sand in the wheels and prevents success. In fact, among the sample of things we tried, and we only we're interested in innovation. We weren't taking pure research proposals, which they may have merit scientifically, but that wasn't and isn't what we're focused on. We're focused on practical innovations. But within that sample, we found that those that had done an RCT before they came to us were actually much more likely to scale. Maybe that has something to do with they have to make the case to the government or to a larger business to adopt it. But we don't know whether this is a causal effect or selection effect. Maybe the best innovations already had this. But I think I'll throw out another hypothesis, which is just a hypothesis. But I think in many other fields, if we're thinking about computer science, if we're thinking about biotech, it's very normal for researchers to then become innovators. What I think we're now reaching the stage in economics where many economists are involved with practical problems, talking to policymakers, talking to farmers, to teachers, and they're now, I think economists are now, thanks in part to the work of JPAL, are now engaged in practical policy problems and in fact are sometimes becoming innovators. And this last column is consistent with that. Okay, so before I go to that, let me just go back here for a second. So, we cited, gave some numbers on number of people reached, but how do you assess this? Because other ones didn't reach so many people. So one way we did that was in some of these cases, not all of them, there was rigorous evidence on the impact per person, of the dollar benefit per person, and it could be expressed in dollar terms. So in those cases, and we only looked at the top here, at the innovations that scaled, but then for these we could get an estimate of the benefit per person. We knew the number of people reached. We could get an estimate of total benefits. So we tried to say, let's take the total benefits from just these 5 innovations in red, where we could quantify it, and set that against not the cost of these 5 innovations. That wouldn't be fair. These are the successful ones. Let's set it against the cost of the entire portfolio of all 43 innovations. So here's what we get when we do that. So the cost of the portfolio over this period was $16 million. The benefit of these 5 was $260 million. This would be higher now because more time has passed. But the ratio was 17 to 1. So it looks like there's scope for socially useful innovation here. Now, why is that? If I go back to the underlying question that colleagues would ask at the University of Chicago and elsewhere, there's all sorts of things that make the private sector more nimble than the government. So, how can you get this high return? Well, I think the answer is that commercial investors are leaving an arbitrage opportunity for socially motivated investors, whether that's in an impact investing fund or government social innovation fund like the ones we're talking about, where there's low private returns, or at least low expected private returns, but high social returns. And economics has something to say about cases where that would happen. So, let me start at the bottom. If you think about something that's producing a carbon benefit, that's going to the customer, say some new type of fertilizer that creates less carbon impact. That's going to have, the customer won't necessarily pay for that, but that's a benefit to society. If you're selling something, Warren Buffett's advice in investing is look for a moat. You want to be the first mover and then lock in that advantage, the way that Google can, for example. Well, that's great if you're a private investor. If you're a social investor, if others are going to be able to copy the innovation, that's actually a plus for you. If you're selling something where there's just the sole potential buyer, let's say software for community health workers, the big buyer is going to be the government, and it may be hard to get returns there because the government can switch to another supplier, they can bargain for a lower price. But that may be very good from a social point of view. I don't want to claim that particular process is good, but the social benefits of the innovation may still be very high. Okay? So I think, and I won't go through this slide fully, but I think this gives a guide to how social innovation funds can think about their work. There's going to be some areas in the upper right that are privately profitable and socially useful, and the private sector will typically go after those areas. There are going to be some areas that don't make sense either way, so beware of stories of this is going to create huge private profits and huge social benefit. It can happen, but you have to watch out for that. You should ask, why hasn't the private sector gone there already? And then there are some areas that are either, it's going to be hard to ever turn a profit with this, they'll require public sector support indefinitely, or other areas that might be profitable once they're developed, but they're risky to invest in. And those are areas where I think social innovation funds can play an important role. And that can help make sure that there's additionality in these investments, so you're not just displacing the private sector. Okay, I'll skip over this. But I think what I would take away from this is that social innovation funds can have very large portfolio returns, even though there'll be individual successes and failures, with this approach where they're open and where they're tiered, so there's an evidence base before the larger investments go in to avoid throwing good money after bad. And often this is by arbitraging a gap between the social value and the private value of innovations. And that has lessons for how these should be designed. It suggests they should be designed not, there are many aspects of venture capital funds that are worth emulating, but you have to take into account that those already exist. And so you're designing this to complement those rather than simply to duplicate them and to trying to duplicate what venture capital funds are doing within a government social innovation agency. Thanks very much.